So joining me up here on the stage are three internationally acclaimed scholars. I'd like first to welcome Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor of history at NYU, professor of history and Italian studies, who is a frequent commentator on CNN. Helmut Walser Smith, to her left, professor of history at Vanderbilt University, and I'm thrilled to announce our current NEH fellow here at the center. And Federico Finchelstein, to his left, professor of history at the New School, and the author of at least, by latest count, 7 books on today's topic. So collectively, we're going to be answering this question, what is fascism, by looking at 3 specific sub-questions. First of all, what is fascism conceptually? Second of all, what is it historically? And finally, how can we understand fascism comparatively between what was going on in Europe and the US in the 30s and what is going on in the US today? So Ruth, if I can just start with you and pose a 2-part question. I think it's probably worth asking why it is so hard, or why it has been so hard for generations for scholars to define what fascism actually is. And then if you could just comment on how your most recent book, Strong Men, tries to answer this question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here and for doing this event. It's really important right now. So it is hard to define it, and many people, Umberto Eco, Robert Paxton, have produced definitions that are also kind of checklists of qualities. Hypernationalism, victimhood, violence, of course, corruption is something we could add, but it was vague by design. Mussolini famously, he was the creator of fascism, and he never defined it officially until 1932. The other thing is that there was no Marx and Engels who provided a kind of theoretical treatise and definitions many decades before. So it started, and then Mussolini created fascism in 1919, and by 1922 he was already prime minister. It was lightning fast. That's very different than Hitler. So one working definition that comes from Mussolini in 1921, he called fascism a revolution of reaction. And it was very confusing to people because he was a former socialist. He took 2 things that were not supposed to go together, socialism and nationalism. And people didn't understand, so this is a clue, one clue about fascism: it shakes everything up. It makes new alliances, new concepts, communicating in new ways using the latest media technologies. So that's the revolution. But the reaction is very key. And we'll talk about this later. It was a reaction then to the left gaining power, to gender emancipation, the beginnings of anti-colonial stirrings. But this has endured as part of fascism, where you shake everything up to repress the rights of certain groups that you call enemies. And they're often the same groups throughout history: Jews, Muslims now, nomadic peoples, the left for right-wing authoritarianism. So to pass to the second, I wrote Strong Men, which came out in 2020, and there's a revised edition in 2021 that includes January 6th, because I wanted to explore what happened to fascism after 1945. Where did all those impulses, those methods, the authoritarian playbook, as I call it, what happened to it? So it traces the right-wing Cold War military juntas, and it goes up to today. So the idea is you can see what stays the same, like leader cults, personality cults, super important, violence, corruption, machismo, and what changes instead. And we'll talk about this later.
Helmut, as a historian of modern Germany, your focus has of course been in that context. And in Germany, fascism was never the preferred term of choice. Rather, it was something called National Socialism. Given what Ruth has just said, how does the German case compare?
Well, I think it's perfectly fine to talk about National Socialism as a variant of fascism, a very special variant. So special, in fact, that in the end, I don't talk about it as a fascist country. Let me put this differently. It's unclear to me that fascism gives one the best analytical lens onto this historical experience. Now, when I say this, I think one has to step backwards and ask oneself, really, what is one trying to figure out? You know, we can talk about these regimes as whole entities, but it is in fact the case that often we are interested in certain aspects of it. And this is also historically true. So, for example, when you go back historically and you ask the question, what are the best analyses of National Socialism saying between 33 and, say, 41? And the answer then is that a lot of them are quite happy to compare National Socialism and Italian fascism or Spanish fascism. And there's not a lot of dissent, especially on the left side of the spectrum, but not just there. So in that early period, that was a powerful lens. But why was it a powerful lens? It was a powerful lens because people were interested in the movement, and it was a powerful lens in part because people were interested in the dynamic. After 41, this begins to change. And why does it change? Well, it changes for a very obvious reason. And that obvious reason is that two things become much more at the center. And those two things are a very aggressive regime, interested not just in regional power, but in a wider conquest, and the Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews, is more central. So I think that when we talk about fascism, we have to be cognizant, in the German case, of the history of that term. Myself, as a scholar, I've always had a problem with fascism, in part because it's already embedded into the history of the fight against it. That's what this podium is about, after all. And it doesn't give me a kind of analytical inventory that is outside the actual thing itself. So that's one.
If I could actually just ask Federico to weigh in at this point, because we've got two competing concepts now, both referring to the far right, fascism, National Socialism, and you'll have to forgive me here. I want to complicate things by bringing in something, Federico, that you know quite a bit about, and that's populism. The distinctions between fascism and populism, some people may say it's not essential to go too granular or inside the weeds to say what the differences are between the two things, and yet I think it's important to maintain some conceptual differentiation. So how would you tackle this question?
Yes, populism is something that, existed before fascism, but as a regime, in other words, when it comes to power and in a way becomes important, because we should remember that when we talk about this, for example, fascism, Zev Sternhell, great Israeli historian of fascism, for me the best, actually, historian of fascism, he said, basically, when you study fascism, it's important to study its ideas, but also other logics of fascism. And here Paxton is also important, another historian Ruth mentioned, which I think is very important. In other words, if you want to start reading about fascism, my recommendation before I answer your question is read Sternhell, read Paxton. These are great, great books. We should return to people that have written before us. And both emphasize this idea that fascism was an ideology, it was a movement, and it was a regime. And when it became a regime, first time in Italy, fascism became not only something important in terms of Italy, but a model worldwide. And by the way, Hitler at that time, he was looking at that and he was saying, this is what I want. So we can call it different names, but when we talk about fascism, we talk about key things. In my own work, and I will answer the question about populism, but I wanted to precede it with first answering what is fascism in my view. Fascism is many things, but I have been trying to see what makes it special, which are the key ingredients. Without these ingredients, there is no fascism. And this is the topic of my next book, coming out in April. It's called The Wannabe Fascist. And here I talk about three different types in terms of ideologies, movements, and regimes. I talk about the fascist, before 45, Mussolini, Hitler, Lugones in Argentina, a lot of fascists in India and many other places, China and so on. I deal with them. Then I talk about the populists after 45. And then I talk finally about what's coming, out from our present, which is in 21st century, we are seeing populists that behave like fascists. So that's why I call people like Trump, people like Bolsonaro and others, I call them wannabe fascists. Now, fascism and populism are distinct in terms of these four elements, what I call in my own book the four pillars of fascism. And these elements are, according to my reading and my work on this, violence and militarization of politics. I mean, the idea here that politics is a war in which you kill people that you don't like, in which you repress people that you don't like to the limit. Of course, you might have dictatorships in history, which are not fascist. But my point is, there is no fascism without extreme notions of violence and the militarization of politics. Number two, lies. All politicians lie, or use metaphors, if you will. Let me be more diplomatic now. But fascists lie in a totalitarian way, in a propaganda way. Not only they lie, they believe they are lies. And worse, they want to change the world in order for the world to be like their lies. Example, Holocaust here, horrible example. One of the major lies of antisemites and Nazis worldwide. Jews are dirty and spread disease. I mean, I know that personally is not true. Many times in the summer, I'm Jewish, I take 4 showers. Lie, big lie, even personally. I know it's a lie. So, but the point is, what the Nazis did with this lie, they put Jews in ghettos and concentration camps. These poor people, these victims of Nazism, became dirty, and yes, eventually they spread disease. And a Nazi would say, I was right. No, you are not. You are changing the world in order for the world to look like your lies. So that's element number 2. Big difference with other ideologies, movements, and regimes. Element number 3, xenophobia and racism. There is racism without fascism, but there is no fascism without racism. The enemy changed in Peru, they hated immigrants from Asia. In Argentina, Germany, they hated the Jews. These were enemy number 1, and so on and so forth. But always racialization of the enemy. Element number 4, dictatorship. There is dictatorship without fascism. There is no fascism without dictatorship. And this is the break with populism, because in populism what you have is authoritarian politics, cults, like a lot of lies and so on, but not in the fascist way. And incidentally, after 45, the first populist regimes in history, Perón in Argentina, Vargas in Brazil, and then you have examples in other Latin American places, they had been either authoritarian dictators or even fascists. Perón was a fascist, which left fascism behind. At least they left these 4 elements, and they created something new, which is to say, a democratically elected authoritarian leader. So populism in a way is fascism with democracy, which is to say, is not fascism. Now, the present, and this is the last thing I want to say, now we are seeing populists like, yes, Trump here, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and others that are returning to these 4 elements. And before the coup d'etat, which was a coup d'etat that we saw in the assault on the Capitol, I would say, well, it seems like they are lacking element number 4 here. I mean, of course, racism is central. Violence is central. Of course, not in the extreme ways of fascism, but it's an element. But they were lacking dictatorship. How would you call somebody that attempts a coup d'etat, which is to say, somebody that wants to remain in power without being elected? A dictator. So for me, we are very close. And my answer, and I finish with this, my answer is, and in Spanish, I'm from Argentina, I would say ni, which is to say yes and no. There are a lot of elements of fascism, and there are elements which make these people want to be fascists. They are not there, they are yet, but they might be.
Thank you, Federico. This brings an end to the first round of our discussion, which is to just talk about fascism conceptually, and I think it's important to recognize that we're building our conceptual apparatus slowly in our morning's discussion, but I want to turn our attention to the historical question, which will bring us to our second round of questions, and that is to ask, why did fascism emerge historically when it did and where it did? And Ruth, if I could ask you as a historian of modern Italy briefly, how would you, from an Italian perspective, explain fascism as a historical phenomenon, keeping an eye on what was uniquely Italian about it and what was reflective of broader European trends?
Yeah, thank you. So, the word fascism comes from the Latin term, for bundle. And there were these fasci movement of groups of Sicilian peasants in the 19th century who were rising up. They were revolutionaries, and they were the Fasci Siciliani. And so Mussolini drew on this radical tradition when he invented fascism after getting kicked out of the Socialist Party for supporting World War I. And he called, they were combat leagues, fasci di combattimento. so fascist combat leagues. And then he created the fascist party so he could get into the electoral system. So it comes out of this kind of radical tradition, and it builds on other things, French national syndicalism, there's whole other genealogies and traditions that come into it. But there would be no fascism without World War I. The utter upheaval where multiple empires fell, nations created, anti-colonial, movements started, including in Italian-occupied Libya, where you had the first independent Arab republic briefly, the Tripolitanian Republic in 1917. That's important, and we never hear about that. And the earliest fascists were veterans who brought the war home. And so they didn't want to demobilize. And Italy had the largest socialist party in Western Europe. It had a very strong left. So that's where we get to the revolution of reaction. And the first, and fascism, this is relevant for today, fascism began as a decentralized militia movement in the countryside, where industrialists, and especially big agriculture patrons and landowners, hired them as kind of bouncers to stop strikes, to stop farm occupations, land occupations. And out of this, they started taking control. This is what Steve Bannon calls the precinct strategy. You take control at the local level, town councils, you trash, socialist trade union offices, and you get power in a capillary fashion, starting in the countryside. And Mussolini's own squads came out of his bodyguards. So that's that, the World War I. And the other thing that is so important that also will be, for every fascist regime, is that the war was birthing a new kind of person. And Mussolini in 1917 wrote a really interesting article called Trenchocracy. Now he said, the war is going to sweep away all the old hierarchies, the old aristocracy. A new man will be created from the trenches. And that goes back to the points about struggle. Fascism is about seeing struggle and violence as the way you move history forward. That's very important. So the trenchocracy was the birth out of the trenches of the new world. A new kind of universe, a new way of thinking and acting. So fascism is also a method. And then just one quickly, it's also a reaction this is the Europeans, or more global, against mass society and the idea of equality, gender equality, racial equality. And so fascism is a way of thinking about how elites can keep power, the tyranny of the minority, to quote a book that's just come out. And Mussolini here's a quote from him in 1922, "Liberty is not an end, it is a means. As a means, it ought to be controlled and dominated. And here falls the talk of force." So Mussolini saw fascism as a way of wresting control, and he allied with elites, conservative elites, to do this, from the left-wing masses, from the feminists, from all the incipient things of a certain kind of modernity that fascism wanted to vanquish, and instead impose its own version of modernity. And that was the subject of my first book, called Fascist Modernities. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Helmut, based on what Ruth just said, if we take this line of argumentation and apply it to the German context, of course, World War I will also be pivotal, and yet you and I both know, as longstanding scholars in the field of German history, that there are some arguments that trace Hitler and Nazism much further back into German history, whether to Luther or to Arminius. So without getting into the whole Sonderweg question, how important is World War I in the rise of National Socialism, and how potentially insufficient is it only to focus on that immediate context?
So obviously it's extremely central. I think it's right to say no World War I, no Hitler. I do think that the lost war is central. I think that the myths deriving, as Ruth said, deriving from the war in this case are central. But we're also dealing in the 20s with a highly frustrated, volatile nationalism, some of which, of course, goes back earlier. But again, the lost war, the terms of the peace make this all a much more volatile situation. We're also talking about a place, the Weimar Republic, which endures immense economic instability, not once in terms of hyperinflation, but twice because of the Great Depression. We're dealing with a democracy from 1930 to 1933, or to the end of 1932, really, that is dying. And we're not paying enough attention to this. I mean, I know that some scholars are, but the situation that we're in is partly a situation, you could say, calling it fascism, but I think the first thing to address is that we're in a situation of a very ill, if not dying, democracy. And that makes it actually quite similar to the Weimar Republic in the years 1930 to 1932. You're looking at a situation in which conservative elites back from the imperial period, but elites still in power, especially conservative elites from the agrarian sector, so that sector that's more left behind. The fascism arguments were that it's actually the industrial sector. Turns out empirically not quite as true. But nevertheless, they are conservative elites, and they are willing to use the fascists, Hitler, however you want to call them, in order to advance their own agenda. This obviously doesn't quite work. And then there's another aspect of this, and this is, I was so interested in your categories and the dictatorship part. And that's of course true, but one thing is, and it's not just of course true, but it's an important point. But one thing that's also important about the National Socialist dimension is the consolidation of power. How fast it went, but even more, the national consolidation, the way in which Germans got behind Hitler very, very quickly. I'm convinced if there had been an election, even a free election in 36, 37, he would have had an absolute majority. I think that had somebody assassinated Hitler, 37, he would have been a national hero. There was an immense amount of popular support behind Adolf Hitler after the consolidation of power. There was an immense undercutting of civil society, what Germans called Gleichschaltung, the national consolidation. Every trade union, every school board, every town, every union, I already said that, sorry, every teachers association, all of these associations were Nazified. And that created a kind of dynamic that wasn't just about a dictatorship, but was also about society itself. And that's one thing that made National Socialism, I think, have a different kind of dynamic than a lot of fascist regimes.
And that transformation, of course, does illustrate the shift from a movement phase to a regime phase, and Federico, you were alluding to those different phases as well. To round out this second round, Federico, would you say that given the crisis of liberalism and the crisis of European mass society after World War I, that provides us with a comparative set of points that we can apply to Latin America? Because as we know, and because you're an expert in that field as well, to talk about fascism in a part of the world where World War I was not experienced as it was in Europe does raise some interesting contrasts.
Yes, I mean, and it's a fascinating question, and I will answer it, simply, which is to say, by going back to our fascist sources in the past or people that identify with this, and it's all here. It didn't matter. In Argentina, in Peru, in India, they also believed that they were living their own war, either internal or external. And they would even say what happens in Mexico with the Mexican Revolution or what happened in Europe, we are living here. Now, you don't need that war, Spain, Portugal, you don't need that war to be part of a fascist movement, and yet it's part of the experience. So, I mean, what is interesting is that, I think what Ruth said is important to highlight, that this becomes first a regime in Italy. That is a really important thing. And what is important about this is that this is the first time that ideas that were shared under different names, because it's fascinating, if you read Uruguayan, Argentine, Peruvian, Hindu intellectuals, Burmese intellectuals, Like, I mean, because now I'm learning from colleagues that are working on these topics. We are learning on all these parts of the world. I mean, they were talking about these ideas. They were talking about the need to eliminate the enemy. That person that you don't like, you eliminate it. They were racializing it. They were, promising violence as the source of everything, as Ruth was also highlighting this issue of violence. Now, I would like to say two things, because this is a big question, and it's very difficult to answer it. And the first related to what Ruth said about violence, and the second to what Helmut said about dictatorship. Now, violence, I mean, we have to understand here the distinction between fascist notions of violence and fascist practices of violence and the rest. Because everybody is violent. I mean, all the isms are violent. But here, here you will not find, in liberal conservative or even communist writings, a theory of violence justifying violence for its own sake. Violence is a means to achieve the end of violence. And here they are, sorry to be a little bit scholarly about this, they are all Weberian. In other words, they believe that power, of course, is related to violence, but you are powerful when you have the monopoly of violence, finally, and you don't use it. Now, fascists had a very different understanding of this. You are powerful when you have the monopoly of violence and you constantly unleash it. So that's very different. Why? Because if you are not violent, you are weak. You are part of democracy. You are part of liberalism or Marxism. The enemy here is always on the right. Let's remember this. Always on the right, always against the left, always against liberalism. Even, always against democracy and, of course, communism. But democracy and communism, they see the same, they see these two, which are pretty different, as part of the same equation. And of course, in most cases, they add the Jews into these ingredients. So democracy, communism, Jews, I mean, all these fantasies. It's important to remember this. Now, let me address this issue of dictatorship. It's a fascinating question, and yet, why, if they were so popular, they created a dictatorship? They didn't need to, but ideologically they had to. And it doesn't matter how you achieve power, but democracy is a problem. And I always tell my students, if I could take the time machine and talk with the Führer, I'm Jewish, so probably he will kill me. But if he doesn't, I will ask him, you claim to be the permanent leader of your people. How you can assess this without elections? And I'm sure he will answer, Federico, you are an idiot. This is a typical question that a person that believes in democracy will ask, because we don't think that you need to prove something that is related to faith. And in fact, in the 1930s, there are a couple of Hitler speeches talking about this. I am the permanent representative of my people. And if we did, I'm one. I'm this, by the way, very Christian, Trinity here. The total identification, Trinity between people, leader, and nation. They are one and the same. We don't need to prove this. And if you are asking this question, you are the enemy. So,
can I?
Please, Ruth, yes.
The other reason you have to have, dictatorship is embedded in the first dictatorship of fully realized one. The reason that Mussolini declared dictatorship in 1925 was that he had ordered a hit job on the head of the Socialist Party, Matteotti, who was also denouncing his corruption and scandals with, the Fascist Party was taking bribes from an American oil company. And so this is very contemporary. So he declared dictatorship to escape a prosecution. And I wrote about this in Strongman in my book. It's very important. The first fully realized dictatorship came because of corruption. And so fascism is law when the lawless become the head of government. And the Holocaust was the most, one of the biggest criminal operations in history. So corruption is absolutely central. Do you know that there's only a few books that have been published on corruption in fascist Italy? It needs to be, and also in Nazi Germany, there's some things by Richard Evans and others, but not enough. And we see from regimes like Putin, we have Netanyahu who has charges against him. This is the playbook that normal leaders, if you have indictments or investigations, you don't want to run for office. Why would you do that? Right? People probe, journalists probe. If you're a strongman, you have to run for office because you got to get into power and shut down the judiciary and domesticate it. And in that period of time, it led to dictatorship. So this is also why they must have absolute power, because they fear whatever that looks like in that age. Today, it's a bit different, but that's the root also, as well as what Federico said.
If we can turn to our last phase, our last session, our last round of questions, rather, and if those of you in the audience would like to start jotting down your questions for the Q&A section, there'll be people collecting them. I just wanted to get us from the interwar period to the present, because as you know, Fighting Fascism has as its subtitle from the interwar period up to the present day. And so I want to invite our panelists to weigh in on two questions. One is, how much or to what extent does fascism help us understand the present moment in the United States? And then, since we're also here to talk about responses to fascism and how Jews and others have and can continue to combat it, we're here, of course, with three people who have written a lot in the mass media, whether in the world of journals and newspapers or on social media platforms. If you can just say a little bit perhaps about how you've tried to combat fascism from this perspective, that would also help us move into the present. So Ruth, if I could start with you.
Yeah, I came from, I grew up in Pacific Palisades in California that had a lot of exiles from Nazism. Famous ones, Thomas Mann, Schoenberg, others. And this started me thinking, I had no family connection to the Holocaust. My dad's from the middle, he's from Israel, my mother's from Scotland. And I started thinking about, what is it about a regime that forces so many people to have to go into exile? And so then I ended up specializing in fascism. But when I saw Trump in 2015 and doing loyalty oaths, saying that there was no truth, that he was the arbiter of truth, allying with Bannon, who admires Mussolini and other fascists. All of this was deeply familiar to me, and it filled me with dread. So I started writing. I'd already been writing for CNN on historical themes. So I covered the whole 2016 election, and then now I'm on TV a lot, and it's really about 50% of my time is educating the public. So one thing, it's not a very nice thing for Sunday morning, but it's very important. Unfortunately, the GOP has become an autocratic party. It has internalized the methods and philosophy of the coup attempt of January 6th. So violence, corruption, and you see the people they put forth for their elite. You have to be people who are willing to cover up crime, like Jim Jordan. You see the leader cult. There was recently an article that those who are following Trump believe him more than their family and friends. It's classic leader cult stuff. And the main thing I want to say is that Trump has been re-educating the American public since 2015. And this was a basis for my report to the January 6th committee, as a career highlight as a first-generation American to contribute to the January 6th committee. He's been using his rallies and his campaign events to change the perception of violence in Americans' minds. And this goes back to fascism. It's not, no, and there you had World War I, right? But if you go along the 20th century into the 21st, you have to get people willing to accept violence as not repugnant, but as something that is morally righteous, necessary sometimes, and even just, and even patriotic. So the January 6th thugs become, those who are in jail become political prisoners. They're noble, right? So Trump has been highly successful, and right now he's using his campaign as a radicalization vehicle. That's why he kicked it off at Waco, Texas, the site of extremism. That's why he went to the gun store. It's why Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump Jr. are telling people right now on Twitter to buy as many guns as possible. That's why finally Matt Gaetz goes to the Iowa State Fair, and people are there with their corn dogs and their toddlers. And he says, he's supporting Trump, it's a campaign appearance, and he says, only through force will we bring change to a corrupt Washington, D.C. So I hear that. Not elections, not reform, not democracy, violence. And so the coup attempt has been internalized. The idea that you change We said this before, all of us. You change history, you move history forward, you have political transitions through violence. And that is what is being preached today.
Thank you. Helmut, if you could weigh in as well.
Thank you. I agree with a great deal of what you said. I guess I again start from my position as a German historian, and I look at this from the standpoint of German history, and not just from the standpoint of what is, I didn't want to use that word, but just, not from the standpoint necessarily of what is fascism. When I do that, though, something very important comes to me right away, and this is that in the German case, we look at a process. That process involves a movement which I have no problem calling fascist, or a variant of fascism, and in line with a lot of what has been said here. We have the death of a democracy, and this is in some respects tied to, but also independent of the movement. The resolve that a country had to keep its democracy in place, the resolve that a country had to defend itself from a movement that really was its gravedigger and was announcing itself as its gravedigger. A third, especially between 1930 and 1933, January 1933, there's a kind of a power vacuum. And the power vacuum is important because it sensitizes us to those weaknesses in our political culture, in our constitution, in the way politics is done, that we have to start paying more attention to. Like, for example, the question of where is the army? Where is the military in this? One of the frightening things that I watched on January 6th was that there was no military support defending our capital. The military was watching it on television. Why was this? Well, there was also something that I thought was not quite right even before all of this happened. And that is that a lame duck president, Donald Trump, was making important shifts in who is running the military. Why is this the case? Why is it the case that a president who has lost an election is able to make crucial national security decisions without someone questioning him? We have to start thinking about those questions of who runs the show at these moments where there's a power vacuum. And finally, the whole question of national consolidation. So this is what I argued I actually did not do nearly as much public intervention as my colleagues, but I did do one, and that one with the Washington Post was to say, 4 years into the Trump regime, Trump government, this looks nothing like National Socialism. Why? The main reason is that the country is divided. There is a great deal of opposition. This is not yet national consolidation. This is not yet Gleichschaltung. There's a vibrant civil society. And so that tells me something about what is absolutely, no matter how these elections come out, important. The maintaining of that civil society against encroachment. And that is where we might be rather soon.
Federico.
Yes, I mean, I think whatever we call it, the fact that, and again, like the term that I'm using, this is the title of my next book, is Wannabe Fascism. But whatever we call it, I think we might all agree that there is a fascist danger here. And the fact that we are asking the question is really bad enough. So my point is like, we don't need to agree. I mean, I don't think we need to agree. Actually, the more we disagree, the more perspectives we can provide. But what is interesting is that, I mean, it's incredible actually to me that we are asking these questions. When I started working on these things, I was born in Argentina just, a year before a coup d'etat, and I live in dictatorship the first years of my life, under dictatorship, and eventually that was gone, and we live in the late 20th century, like a moment in which we were studying these questions more in terms of the past. This was not supposed to be returning, and what we see is a returning of many things that were in vogue in the 1920s and 1930s, and this is a discussion, in my opinion. The way we answer it, like, of course we will disagree. We don't need to agree, but the agreement perhaps is like this one, that there is something wrong here, something very anti-democratic that is coming back, however we call it. In terms of, we are asking the questions in terms of what we are working, and next week I need to finish. In fact, I will be presenting at Harvard like a talk on Salvemini, the first historian of fascism. And this is a professor like us who he said something very interesting, which I would like to mention, or somebody said something very interesting about him. I don't remember exactly now, but he was against the fascists before fascism was born. And I think this is our situation. Of course, after the assassination of Matteotti, he had to leave, and he became eventually a professor at Harvard, and then he returned to Italy at the end of his life. By the way, when he left, before writing the first books on the history of fascism, he was already in his 60s. And this is a person that was already super accomplished, and the books on fascism are very late. And he knew. And as soon as the fascists arrived to power, they knew Salvemini was an enemy. Of course, he was a socialist and so on. But this is something that we should remember, I think, in terms of the first intellectuals dealing with this, because they knew they were against something that was already, they didn't know exactly what it was going to be, but they knew it was bad. And in terms of public interventions, I think, Ruth, you are a model. I have read your stuff again and again. I continue to learn from it. And I try to do something as much as I can following this pattern. We need, I think, to intervene as much as we can in terms of the public. And also, I'm a recent American citizen. For me also, when I was asked to contribute a statement to the January 6th committee, it was highlight for me, in so many ways. And the last thing I want to say, and I'm sorry I was right, in fact, that when Trump lost the election, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, if he continues to deny this, then we run the risk of having a coup d'etat here. And I wrote it, it was the title. And I thought, oh my God, I don't want to be right on this when this happened. But the point is here, as citizens, we are always hoping, and as scholars, we know that this is no good. And so this is a problem. When people were thinking that he was going to become presidential, my research part, not my citizen part, said, this is impossible. This is impossible, or almost impossible. And in fact, the New York Times asked him later, are you going to cease now with the demonization? And Trump naturally said, why? I won. And this is people that, power here is important. We are talking about politicians. We should not forget this, by the way. But I think also what Ruth said is central here. These are people that are escaping justice by creating more chaos. And this is, the situation in so many cases that we need to be, there are so many red flags here. Anyway.
I'd like to get to some of our questions, and I have three that we'll do in reverse order, directed to three of our panelists, and then I have one, if we have time, one final question that all three of you can weigh in on. So for Federico, one audience member asks you to explain the following. You characterize the fascist leaders correctly as being against democracy and communism. Why would Stalin and Lenin not be considered fascists?
Well, if you start with the last chapter of my book, for me, of my next book. It's easy for me now to talk about things that nobody knows. Only a few people know about this, so I can say whatever I want. But it's true that I write about this, and I try to answer this question in the book, which is, of course, communism eventually was like a long dictatorship in so many countries, still is. And yet, when you read particularly Lenin, like, big theories of dictatorship, in fact, like he wrote on dictatorship a lot in his theoretical writings. Of course, he took, as you know, like this small kind of sentence, intervention by Marx, when he said, this is about the dictatorship of the proletariat. This was not important for Marx. I mean, it's just a sentence. And the communists reified this, made it huge, because they were thinking that dictatorship was the answer to the political problems of the time, and yet they always talk about dictatorship as a transition. Of course, you might say, yeah, they were lying. But in theory, because here is a difference between theory and practice. In theory, they always said that dictatorship was a transition towards a democracy, a fantasy democracy that eventually would happen. Whereas in fascism, you don't see this. You don't see this kind of talk about, the permanent leadership being a transition to something else. It's about that. So that is a big difference, I think, between Marxist or communist notions of dictatorship and practices of dictatorship and the fascist ones.
Thank you.
Can I just very
Please.
quickly add to that? I think another important aspect of this is historical, and that is to say that the first time Communist Party comes to power, it comes in the wake of World War I and of a very bloody civil war. So the left, which already has a military tradition, is dramatically militarized at the beginning of in the first part of the 20th century through 8 years of war. And that very much shaped that part of the world and communism in that part of the world.
Helmut, if I could apply the second question raised by an audience member, they ask, if we want to understand Hitler's power, does it come more from the masses that support him or the enablers at the elite level who ultimately brought him into power?
No, that's a dichotomous question, which I'm not going to fall into that easily, but it's an important question. Look, of course, the answer is really both. I'm thinking back to your imaginary conversation, and he might have called you an idiot, but he actually would have doubted it a little bit, because he was tremendously mindful of his own popularity. And he didn't hold elections, but he had a whole apparatus of report writers telling him how certain policies were going over with the population. And he sometimes pulled back. So Hitler was very concerned about his popularity. That was always the case. In fact, there's an argument to be made that part of who Hitler was has to do with his, in Bavaria, in Munich, in the early 20s, where he gets his whole rhetorical abilities, his whole charisma, has to do with him talking to like-minded, frustrated, nationalist Bavarian soldiers who he's trying to re-educate, and they're loving what he has to say. The more they love it, the more he says it. So there's a kind of echo chamber going on there, evocative of a little bit the kind of echo chambers that are created now. But it's that loophole. So to Hitler, his popularity is important, but I think you're absolutely right. Dictatorship is the key to becoming popular. That's why these two things, getting him into power and his popularity, are just tied together.
And Ruth, if you could bring us to the finish line here, I'm going to combine two questions into one directed to you. Would you say that at the personal level, politically speaking, Trump himself is a fascist? And apart from him, if he were not on the political scene, who would be the second most dangerous fascist threat in the country? You don't have to answer by name, per se, if you don't feel like it. You can talk about broader forces or trends, but that's a two-part question.
So this is one of the questions I get most often. Is there a method to Trump? Is he doing all this by design, or is he just making it up as he goes along? And it's kind of both. There's a reason that Trump is also re-educating Americans to like authoritarian leaders. Not a day goes by where he's like, oh, love letters with the head of North Korea, or Putin, he's the best, he's brilliant, or Xi, or think of who he praises and those he doesn't praise. So he's doing this kind of changing, he's creating an emotional and psychological and political culture climate to accept authoritarianism. And everything he does, he is a superb propagandist. It's unfortunately one of these situations people are going to realize later how these are the people he has convinced he's, God, how skilled he was at everything he does. And all of his communications, all of his attention to the manufacturing of charisma. So that's part of it. So there is a design there to have absolute power. And his models are other autocrats. And that's what he wants. And he's very open. And the key thing is when he said in January 2016, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and I wouldn't lose any followers. He was telling, this goes back to the violence theme, but he was saying that he is going to associate himself with violence, that he's personally capable of violence. And here's the key, he'll be loved because of that. The lawless goes back to the lawless. So he's a uniquely dangerous also because he is a criminal in so many ways. I mean, tax fraud, bribery, sexual assault, right? And by the way, a lot of authoritarians either have a criminal record when they're running for office or they're under investigation. Berlusconi, Putin, Trump, and there's so many of them. They are criminals. And so they come to power and they adjust. You know how Federico said that they adjust reality so their lies become the truth? They also adjust institutions so that they promote lawlessness and crime. So the second most dangerous people, it's an entity, it's the GOP. For the reasons I said before, the GOP has internalized corruption and violence, and think about all the stuff about masculinity, homophobia. So all of these things have been internalized, and they now have exited democracy. So just to close, the unique danger we don't have a multi-party system where you can have these big, you see in the world, these big multi-party coalitions against the autocrats. Now, they haven't won recently, but they've almost won in some cases. We don't have that option. So the Republicans who they have nowhere to go. And indeed, they're being threatened. So I'll just leave you with this chilling, the reason I say it's the whole GOP, that debate where all of them, this was a loyalty performance straight out of authoritarian history, where they all raised their hands except for Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, who has 0% popularity as a result. And they said, I will support Trump even if he becomes a convicted felon. That's it.
Please join me in thanking our three panelists.